Hey everybody, what is going on? HexLex here. Got another Master Duel video for you. This one is one that has been highly requested. We're finally getting into the hand trap guide for Master Duel. I have made videos in the past about using hand traps against certain decks, and that actually is going to be a section we'll cover more towards the end of the video. We'll get into, or in the latter half of the video, we'll get into, using hand traps against the top 10 most current meta relevant decks. But I did also want this video to have some sort of lasting impact, right? So more than just talk about how to use hand traps against the decks of the current meta, I'm also going to talk about using hand traps generally, not only each individual hand trap, but activating hand traps as a whole. That way, this guide should have relevance even if none of these decks that I talk about are still in the meta at some point in the future. But before we get into things, I really do have to give a huge thank you to both my Patreon members as well as members here on YouTube as well. It was you all in the polls that voted for this to be my next sort of long form edit video that I made, and really without the support of the YouTube and Patreon members, this channel would not be possible. It definitely takes a lot of time to record and edit for daily YouTube videos, including working in much longer edits like these that can take sometimes up to a week even, or even multiple days just to get one of these videos out. That's of course in addition to all the IRL stuff I have to do, work and all that fun stuff. So really without that kind of support, this channel as a whole would not be possible. Of course it wouldn't be possible without everyone watching and then subscribing here on YouTube as well, but gotta give an extra huge shout out to you Patreon and YouTube members. Thank you all so very much. And if you're interested in offering some support to the channel, which is hugely appreciated, you can check that out in the links in the description below to both Patreon and YouTube. We also have the affiliate partnership with Untapped. That's a free companion that you can download that I show off in a lot of my Master Duel videos. So again, if you want to support the channel, then checking that out is also very much appreciated. But so is your viewership. Thank you all, each and every one of you. Alright, so with that out of the way, let's get into using hand traps in Master Duel. So this guide is going to mostly talk about important timings for using hand traps, but in my opinion, the best way to learn this, beyond even watching videos like this or reading written guides, is to play a lot of games both with and or against meta decks, but ideally both. One very common trend you'll notice as I talk about these is that almost every single hand trap to use correctly requires some amount of knowledge of your opponent's deck, even ones with lingering effects like Maxx and Dimension Shifter. As you use these hand traps against various decks, you should definitely make note of times that this disruption has high or low impact, and also when you're playing games, note the times when opponents using hand traps against you is particularly good or bad, right? By being observant and picking up on this kind of a thing, again, that is actually going to be the fastest way, in my opinion, that you're going to get used to knowing when to use hand traps in the meta. But again, it's definitely understandable to want the help of a guide to kind of point you in the right direction, which again, I hope to do here. So a little disclaimer that I want to throw out, a very important one before we start getting into things, is that a lot of the situations where I'll be talking about when to use hand traps, especially against specific decks, are going to be operating under the assumption that you're only holding that one hand trap and no other hand traps in your hand, right? Now, granted, you can still apply a lot of the following information if you do open more than one hand trap as far as timings of when to use stuff, but it's worth noting that opening multiple hand traps will add so many variables to the situation. For example, let's say we open a hand like Maxx, Ash Blossom, Imperm, Called By, and Triple Tack going second. With a hand like this, I'm prioritizing resolving Maxx before the other hand traps, right? That way I can get draws and find some plays, because a hand like this doesn't have any plays that I can do on my turn. It's, fine if I can stop my opponent from making plays, but then if I don't have anything to do on the next turn, then using stuff like Ash and Imperm will really just buy me time to just get, beaten on turn 3, right? But now, let's say instead of the triple tack at the end, we open a one-card starter like Snake Eye Ash. Now, in this situation, I would be more inclined to use Ashe and Imperm early to stop their plays altogether, then Maxx see if they have counters or extenders, because now I'm already holding a one-card starter that I know can win me the duel by itself. So that's kind of a good example of where opening not only multiple hand traps, but also other cards like a in-engine starter affects what hand traps you use and in what order. Further, another example, let's say that you're holding both Valor and Imperm during your opponent's turn. Generally speaking, I'll prioritize Valor here, since I won't be able to use it on my turn, whereas Imperm, I can either activate it on one of their monsters before I begin my plays, or I could set it and get the column negate, right? On the other hand, if I'm holding Gamma and Imperm on my opponent's turn, I might actually try to prioritize Imperm first, because if I Gamma first, then it and Driver will be on my field, and I can no longer use the Imperm during that turn. So, when considering which hand trap to use, or whether to use a hand trap or not, you should always think first about the implications of both letting the card resolve or negating it, right? So what does the board state look like after the card is negated? Do they have anything in play or in their graveyard that would guarantee the follow-up, right? If you do let the card resolve, what kind of impact does that have on the game state? Could it lead to something better to negate, or perhaps something so weak that it's not worth negating at all? So you definitely want to keep questions like these in mind as we explore the uses of each hand trap, both generally and in specific matchups. Another important aspect to using hand traps well, as well as on-board negates, in specifically Master Duel, is to make sure that you have the right settings. So let's go on over to Master Duel, and I'll show you firsthand what settings I use to get good optimal use out of hand traps. Okay, so another very important aspect of using hand traps well in Master Duel is to actually also make sure that you have the right settings for your game. And this is something that is highly specific to Master Duel. So I want to make sure that I covered this part specifically as well. So if we go up here to the sub menu, game settings, and then Duel, you're going to see as the second option here, activation confirmation. I believe by default it starts on auto, which means if you have this setting selected, your timer, or your little button at the bottom, not the timer rather, but the button is always just going to be on auto by default. And then if you click it, it'll be on, on and then off. You can cycle through by clicking the button. And that's the default setting that most people have. But if you actually go in here and explore some of these options, there are a couple that I'm particularly a big fan of. So I'll talk about my custom settings here in just a second, but I think that switch plus hold, if you're particularly a PC player, is going to be a very good option, because this will still have the button by default be on auto. However, with switch plus hold, rather than clicking on the button itself and having to cycle between auto, on, and off, switch plus hold allows you to, you can hold the left button to confirm activation and right button to deny activation. Basically, under switch plus hold, if you hold, I always mix this up, so I just want to make sure, yeah, left click. Under switch plus hold, if you hold down left click, the toggle will switch to on. And if you hold down right click, it'll switch to off. This is very nice, because if you're trying to just click the button itself and like cycle through them, then you can often miss your opportunity to use hand traps when you want to. So I like switch plus hold, but I really like the custom settings that I have here right now. I'm going to talk about these a little bit here. So these are my current custom settings. Show switch button on, that just means showing the button that lets you switch between auto, on, and off. Of course, I do want that on, for sure. So reset activation confirmation settings. This enables activation confirmation at the end of the turn. What this means is that whenever it goes into the next player's turn, if my little button is not already set to on, it'll automatically flip to on. I also have it set so at the beginning of the duel, it'll be on confirmation activation, which is again, the little button being on. So that way, I'm always starting the duel with it on, and I'm starting every turn with it on. Basically, the reason I really like this is because there are a lot of timings in which you need to activate hand traps that you can't do if your activation confirmation is set to auto. The most notable of which will be in an open game state. For example, if your opponent summons a monster like Samsara D-Lotus and you have Effect Veiler in hand, you actually have an opportunity to use that before the Samsara D Lotus activates its effect. Basically, once any monster has been successfully summoned or any effect has successfully resolved, there is an open game state in which players can use their priority, right? And if you have your toggle set to auto, you're not going to be able to take advantage of that. But if it's set to on, then you can. So that's why I like my settings the way they are here. And then again, I have left and right button for hold for confirm activation and do not confirm. Basically, with my setup here, I just have to click the right button if I don't want to activate something. Let me hop into like an example game real quick and I'll show y'all what I'm talking about a little bit. Okay, so I'm just going into a solo mode duel real quick with Mathmech because it has a lot of hand traps, so hopefully illustrate this. Perfect, we have Maxx, so I can. So, okay, see how my button starts on auto? Or not on auto, on rather, down here? And now, as a result, it's asking me during my draw phase if I want to activate Maxx. If I right click, I can simply deny it. But it's going to ask me again during the standby phase, again because it's set to on by default. So if I hold right click, I'm holding right click down right now. Now I'm releasing, now I'm letting go. Or holding it again, you know what I mean. So basically all that I have to worry about doing with my settings like this is, like at the bottom there, holding right click to make sure that my activation confirmation is off, right? Let's see, it'll be easier to demonstrate this going into the opponent's turn, right? So as we click end phase, again during my end phase because my thing is set to on, it's going to ask me. Now going into their turn, it'll ask me during their draw phase. But if I wanted to hide the fact that I have Maxx, I can actually just hold off, right, through their draw phase and also through all their other phases to hide that I have it. Now, however, I've let go and it's on now, and now I can use Maxx at any time there's an open game state, regardless of if it's a card or effect being activated, or even if it's not. See, it says a monster has been equipped with an equip card, activate a card or effect. This is the open game state in which I can use the hand trap if I want to. Same now as we're about to end the main phase, right? So this is the difference between on and auto, and why I think it is so important and so critical to have those settings enabled here in Master Duel. Again, this is a very this client specific thing, but it is, I do still think, extremely important to note for for Master Duel. So I'll show them on screen again here. You can pause if you want to see. I think that this is the optimal way to have your settings, is this custom setup for the ability to use hand traps at any, or really quick effects in general, at the correct moments. But if you didn't want to deal with all this, you could just do switch and hold, and I think that's also an equally viable solution there. I would not, however, just stick to the auto default, where again, you have to rely on clicking this button down here and cycling through on, off, and auto. It's just, it's far too slow, it's far too time and thought consuming. Much easier to do it the other way, in my opinion. Okay, now that we have covered that, let's go ahead and start getting into the bulk of actually talking about these hand traps. Okay, so now that we've covered a lot of the basics, I'm going to start talking about the hand traps themselves. As mentioned before, I'm going to start with how I generally like to use these hand traps. Again, with the aim that this knowledge will be applicable to more than just the specific decks we'll talk about later, that you can use this information for, pretty much the entirety, ideally, of playing Master Duel. Now, there are quite a few different hand traps in the game, a lot of very niche ones as well. Stuff like, Ghost Ogre, Ghost Bell, that have really particular activation timings. So, in order to keep things as generalized as possible, I'm only going to be covering the most common hand traps that are played in Yu-Gi-Oh! Again, because a lot of these niche ones have to be activated at a specific time anyway, and also to make sure that I'm covering as many different, hand traps for as many different decks as possible. We're mainly going to be focusing on Maxx, Ash Blossom, Effect Veiler, Infinite Permanence, Psyframe Gear Gamma, and Nibiru the Primal Being. These are going to be the main hand traps that we talk about. In the future, I might make a video for more niche hand traps if there ends up being a lot of interest in it, but that would definitely require not only a lot more research, but honestly would probably double the length of this video, which is already probably going to be pretty long. So, but if again you are looking for Hand Trap Guide Part 2, where we talk about stuff like, again, D-Shifter, Ghost Ogre, Ghost Bell, more niche hand traps, then definitely feel free to let me know in the comments, and that is something we can look at in the future. But for now, we're going to focus on the big ones. And let's start with the biggest, most popular hand trap of them all, everyone's favorite level 2 Earth insect. That is, of course, going to be Maxx. So Maxx is a card that you look at it, right? It's got a lingering effect. It's an incredibly powerful one. And if your opponent plays into it, you get a bunch of draws. If they don't, that means they're not special summoning and you've effectively ended their turn. Now, this, on the surface, seems very simple to use. You activate it at some point during your opponent's turn, and if it resolves, your odds of winning go up very noticeably. So in that regard, you might think, well, there can't be that much nuance to using Maxx. You resolve it, and again, if it does resolve, then it wins, right? Well, there are actually a lot of things to consider with Maxx. While, yes, if you just activate it right away and your opponent doesn't do any special summons, you effectively ended their turn, that is really strong. There are still ways that you can maximize the advantage you get off of Maxx. Not only in terms of drawing you cards, but you can also use your Maxx in a way that can make your opponent waste their resources. So there are generally two different times to activate Maxx. During the draw and standby phase before the opponent makes plays, I often refer to this as shotgunning or firing off the Maxx, right? Or during the main phase when your opponent is already making their plays, I often call this holding the Maxx. So that's what I mean if I say firing off the Maxx or holding the Maxx in the future in this video, which I imagine I will a lot. That's what I'm referring to. So firing off the Maxx during the draw or standby phase does play around Triple Tactics talent, and it will get you draws off of summons that don't start chains. Cards like Diabellstar the Black Witch, Kashtira Unicorn, Kashtira Fenrir, that kind of a thing, right? But at the same time, it is also a very heads-up play that potentially lets your opponent hold their resources and not give you any draws. Which, again, as we discussed, is not necessarily the worst thing in the world, because it effectively means your opponent isn't doing anything on their turn. Holding the Maxx, on the other hand, this plays around Cyframe Gear Gamma better. It does guarantee you draws because you can chain the Maxx to an activated effect that will special summon a monster. But most importantly, in my opinion, is that, again, it'll make your opponent use more of their resources, right? So they will be activating that effect that causes them to special summon instead of just holding on to it, right, for another turn. So which is better? There are definitely pros and cons for both, and it can also depend on the matchup as well. There are certain decks where firing off the Maxx is actually better than holding it, and of course vice versa as well. But the thing is, with Master Duel Ranked Ladder, it's extremely rare that you're going to be able to know what your opponent is on, right? For that reason, I believe that on Master Duel Ranked Ladder, if your opponent goes first and you open Maxx, it is generally better to hold it and not fire it off, again, with the idea of making them commit their resources. We'll talk about some more specific examples of that here later on in the video as well. Beyond that, though, I also think that it's generally better to get hit with a Triple Tactics talent than a Cyframe Gear Gamma if Maxx is the only hand trap you have, right? So if that is the case and you get hit with Gamma because you fired it off during the draw and standby phase when your opponent didn't have any monsters in play, then your Maxx is negated altogether. You have no further access to hand traps, and your opponent's going to be able to go off uninhibited, right? However, if you wait to hold the Maxx till the main phase when your opponent has a monster in play, then, again, they can't Gamma because they have a monster in play. The main way that they're going to respond is with the Triple Tactics talent, likely. There is also, of course, stuff like Ash Blossom and Call By, but those cards will stop Maxx no matter when you activate it, which is why I'm not really factoring them in here. And again, if Maxi is your only hand trap, then I think it is better to get triple tacked than to get Gammaed, because you know, the triple tack is only going to hand rip you for one card. If your opponent does still commit to plays, they'll be drawing you multiple cards with the special summon. And yeah, it can be really annoying to get your starter hand ripped and then they don't make any plays and you don't draw any cards. But again, we're still in a situation where they didn't make any plays, and you know, there's a lot of situations where you'll have multiple starters, where you'll be able to top deck into a starter, so on and so forth. It can also be worth it, by the way, another timing to use Maxi. It can also be very much worth it to chain Maxi to an effect that draws more cards, right? If your opponent leads with like, you know, Pot of Desires, for example, it might seem weird, but it's actually worth considering chaining Maxi to a card like that, because it could draw them into a card like Ash Blossom or Call By or Crossout, whereas they might not have had that card in hand before. Just something else to consider when activating the Maxi as well. I just want to make sure that I clarify too real quick that I don't think firing off Maxi is like a horrible idea. I think, again, if you're doing it turn one and your opponent's going first and you don't know what they're on and you're just doing that every single time, I think that's generally a misplay. But it's still not horrible because, again, as we touched on earlier, there are pros to it, right? The fact that you do get draws for cards that, again, special summon and don't start a chain link. And to be fair, you might have a hand where you really don't want to get triple tacked, right? This is another situation where what you open could very easily depend on when you activate a card, right? Because if you open more hand traps and a starter, then it's not as bad of an idea to Maxi during the draw phase, because if you get Gammaed, you'll still have more hand traps to play with, and then you'll still have starters anyway, so you're not going to be relying on the draws. Again, as I touched on in the intro, a lot of the stuff is very situationally dependent, but again, I'm going to be trying to speak from a standpoint where you only open the one hand trap more often than not, but just again, keep that in mind as we're talking about all this stuff. Okay, let's get into Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. So when it comes to Maxi, I know I just said we're going to talk about Ash Blossom, now I'm referring to Maxi again. But Maxi is a hand trap that has like a lingering effect. So talking about it from a general perspective is a lot easier than a lot of these other ones we're about to talk about here. Ash Blossom being the first example of that, because knowing what cards your opponent is trying to pull from their deck is so important to knowing when to use the Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. Funnily enough, a lot of the time, if they lead their turn one with a spell card that searches or dumps cards, it's actually not worth it to Ash them, since those cards are searching cards that can be Ash Blossomed anyway, and the opponent could easily be holding them for follow-up. For an example of some of these kinds of spells, think like Reinforcement of the Army, Foolish Burial Goods, Small World, Wanted, Nightmare Throne, Bonfire, any of the Pot of cards, really, Extravagance, Prosperity, Desires. I don't think any of these cards are generally, if it's the first thing they're playing on turn one, I would not Ash any of them. Because again, all of these cards are going to typically grab something that can be Ash Blossomed anyway, and if you Ash Blossom this spell, they could very easily just also be holding, you know, the card they want to play anyway. And now you're down a hand trap and you have effectively stopped nothing at all. If you do find yourself in a matchup where you're not very familiar with your opponent's deck and you're wondering when you should use your Ash Blossom, generally speaking, it does tend to be better to use it earlier. I know I just said that if they lead with certain spell cards that you shouldn't, you know, necessarily Ash it right away. But let's say they lead with a normal summon that would search a card, or you know, a card like 1-for-1, right? That discards a card and then summons a card from deck. Those are really good times to Ash Blossom early, because your opponent has committed some kind of a resource that you're not only trading, of course, to gain the effect for Ash Blossom, but you're effectively trading that resource. Like, for example, if they lead normal summon Stratos and you Ash Blossom that, then, you know, they've used their normal summon, and now they don't have that again. You've not only taken away their search, but now, again, they're down the resource of a normal summon. Again, we look at, like, 1-for-1, for example, right? You 1-for-1, or they 1-for-1, they send a monster from the hand to the graveyard, and you Ash Blossom that. You've not only stopped the summon from the deck, but now they're also down a card from their hand. Generally speaking, effects that summon from the deck are almost always worth ashing. You know, even if it doesn't stop their combo altogether, it'll leave them down on the number of bodies that they can make their end board with, which will likely affect their ability to make a more effective end board. And actually, to again follow up on that point I made before, a lot of the reason why you don't want to ash cards like Rhoda and Foolish Burial and the Pot of cards is that they don't require any real commitment, right, to use them. It's just the first spell your opponent's played on that turn, and they could be holding any number of cards. They can still normal summon, you know, they still have all these resources to work with, which is, again, kind of part of the reason why they're generally not worth ashing those kinds of spell cards. Now, granted, if your opponent's in a situation where they're in top deck mode and they top deck Pot of Desires and then they activate it, then yeah, you should definitely Ash Blossom that, right? Another thing that I actually should have mentioned more towards the top of the video is that a lot of the time I'm going to be focusing on turn 1 interactions because things being turn 2 or later definitely affect when you would use certain disruptions. But if there are specific examples of that, I am going to try to cover them in the matchups guide a little bit later on here. And then, of course, there's the very most common and popular use of Ash Blossom, and that is against Maxx, which is why Ash Blossom does see the second most play behind Maxx as far as, like, you know, most popular hand trap. So I will say that Ash Blossom is also just quite good in general. There are some people that say that, like, Ash Blossom is actually format dependent, and if it weren't for Maxx, this hand trap wouldn't see any play at all. I don't know about that. I think there have been maybe a couple of times in Master Duel where if Maxx weren't around, you wouldn't Ash Blossom. Like, I'm thinking particularly of, like, any format where Sword Soul was tier 1. You know, Ash Blossom really is only good against Sword Soul Emergence, ironically a Searcher spell. That one you do actually want to hit with Ash Blossom just because, aside from that and Ecclesia, Sword Soul doesn't really have any cards that can even be ashed at all. So yeah, I mean, I do understand people saying that, like, Ash Blossom would not be an auto-include if it weren't for Maxx to Master Duel decks, but being real, I still think that Ash Blossom would see play in Master Duel decks at 3 in, like, 90 to 95% of the formats we've had so far, even if Maxx weren't legal. Overall, it does end up being a very popular hand trap, and for good reason. It has a lot of uses against decks in general, and of course against the actual most used hand trap of the format. Alright, so moving forward for this guide, I'm gonna kind of lump Valor, Imperm, and Gamma into one. I did almost separate Gamma for not only this section, but the matchup sections we're gonna see moving forward, but a lot of the time, Gamma does tend to be activated around the same time as Valor Imperm, as far as, like, when you would want to use it as disruption, but if there are notable differences, I will make sure to note that. Of course, the main difference between the cards is that Effect Valor in Infinite Permanence can only be used to negate a monster effect on the field, whereas Gamma can negate any monster effect regardless of where it's activated. Gamma also destroys the monster as well, so another very notable difference. Now, of course, Gamma has the biggest drawback of these 3 hand traps, which is that you have to control no monsters in order to be able to use it, right? So if you're going second, that's not that big of a deal, but, you know, turn 1, if you open Gamma, you're going to make plays, and a lot of the time, Gamma's not going to be very useful. Whereas Effect Valor or Imperm, you can either hold Valor or set Imperm if you open on turn 1 in addition to your plays. That's why Valor and Imperm are generally more widely used than Gamma. Whether or not you play Gamma can also end up being kind of deck dependent, right? Because if, for example, you're playing a combo deck where all of your combos start by normal summoning a monster, Gamma is not going to be nearly as good as if all of your combos start by, like, not having a monster on the field. Yubel is actually a decent example of that, between Nightmare Throne and notably Samsara Delo distributing itself, that being the deck's most common starter. You don't have any monsters on the field when that effect resolves, so if your opponent tries to hand trap in response to it, then Gamma becomes a lot more feasible as an option, right? But on to using monster negates. A good time to use monster negates against a deck that you're not familiar with is, again, if your opponent has used their normal summon on a monster for a card that, you know, has some sort of impactful effect like searching or summoning a monster, as that can force your opponent to have an additional extender in hand in order to continue playing, right? Because, again, as we talked about with Ash Blossom, by using the hand trap out on a monster that's been normal summoned, we not only negate the effect, but now the opponent has used use their resource of the normal summon, and will, again, often require that additional card to be in their opening hand, which could potentially turn a 1-card combo into a 2-card combo, which actually overall makes it less likely they'll be able to combo, because it will then require them to have opened both of those specific cards as opposed to simply the one that you've negated, right? Think like, you know, Imperming Snake Eye Ash. Like, yeah, sometimes they have Bonfire for Poplar anyway, but that doesn't mean that Imperming Snake Eye Ash is not a good play, right? And this is actually doubly true for Gamma, because again, Gamma will not only negate the card, but also destroy it. And destroying that monster is even better, because it denies your opponent even more resources, which will make it even more difficult for them to combo off. And of course, if you are able to resolve the Gamma on your turn, then you have the driver and the Gamma itself on your field. Now, you have more bodies to combo off with. Again, Gamma being a more noticeable swing and advantage for you, but also more conditional when it comes to actually activating it. And as I touched on before, another thing to note about Gamma is that if you do summon it, it might make you unable to use stuff like Imperm if that's also in your hand. So do keep that in mind as well. However, I will say that there are some decks that have monsters they play later in the turn that have a very high impact effect, and in that case, you'll definitely want to save it for that. There's kind of an obscure example, but you know, I think about TG over Dragonar, right? While, yeah, you could use the Veiler or Imperm earlier on in the combo to stop them from even summoning the Over Dragonar, if you wait for Over Dragonar, you know, this is a highly impactful effect that revives multiple monsters from the graveyard, and also by waiting, you then don't get yourself in a situation where you negate early, and through an extender, they are able to summon the Over Dragonar or something similar later anyway, and they just do their combo, right? Again, the idea is about making your opponent use up more of their resources. So again, and you know, this is gonna be something that you hear a lot, because it's very, very true about using hand traps. Knowledge of your opponent's deck, how it plays, and what it does is going to be by far the most important factor when it comes to using these monster effect negates. Okay, and finally, Nibiru the Primal Being. This is a hand trap that can actually often be very tricky to use because it's rather conditional. Obviously, your opponent has to summon 5 times in order to be able to use it, right? But even beyond that, your opponent summoning 5 times could potentially mean they have either a card that could negate Nibiru or a card that even benefits from going to the graveyard off of Nibiru in play already by the time you can even begin to activate the effect, right? So I know I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but I think that more so, honestly, than any of these other hand traps, Nibiru actually probably requires the most knowledge of your opponent's deck, again, more so than any of the other hand traps we're going to be talking about, in order to effectively use. Because not only could they put out a negate, but there are some decks that can naturally, through their own combo line, still recover and continue their plays anyway, even if you nib them right on the 5th summon. Again, as I said before, knowing whether they can make negates or not is also important. So like, for example, if you know your opponent's deck is on Baron de Fleur, right? And you see they have the materials on field to make a level 10 synchro, you know, it doesn't matter if those are the only monsters in play. If you can Nibiru, you kind of got to do it right there, because otherwise they're going to make a Baron de Fleur, like I said before, and then they're just going to obviously negate with Baron's effect your Nibiru. So like, yeah, in that situation, you know, hypothetically nib, like in Super Heavy Samurai, right? You know, you've got to nib them when they have the Excel Stardust and the level 2 tuner on the field. Otherwise, they just go straight into the Baron de Fleur. And yeah, they are going to be able to Pendulum Summon anyway and continue their plays, but it's better to make sure that they don't have the Baron than it is to just have not used Nibiru at all. They have their board they would have made anyway, and then also the Baron that you have to deal with anyway. However, on kind of the flip side of that, there are actually decks out there that don't make any negates at all. Like, there's actually multiple meta-relevant decks right now that don't make any negates as part of their end board at all. And for decks like that, you can actually wait until the end of the main phase to use the Nibiru. And the reason you would want to wait until the end of the main and not just do it right on the 5th summon right away, even if that'll stop their plays anyway, is that by doing so, you make your opponent use up more of their resources, which is another very recurring trend that you're probably noticing here, that the most optimal use of hand traps is most often the way that causes your opponent to lose most of their cards, right? Which makes sense. So by waiting until the end of the main for these decks that don't make negates anyway, now you've not only eaten all of the cards that they would use to combo up till their end board, but also their end board as well. On the flip side of that, then there are some decks out there, again, multiple meta-relevant decks, that will often not even do 5/7s on their turns. There are some decks, like a lot of very control-y or stun decks, that never, literally never do 5/7s on their turn. So either way, the use of Nibiru is not only dependent on how well you know the opponent's deck, but even from a wider perspective, it is very situationally and matchup dependent as to where and when Nibiru is going to be its most useful. Which again, I think is another reason why it is probably the trickiest of these hand traps to use. But again, we will be talking a little bit more about that. And I think we are actually at the point where we are ready to talk a little bit more about that. So yeah, we've covered the general uses of the most common hand traps in the game, and also using hand traps specifically in Master Duel, like those settings and whatnot. So for those of you who are just like, yeah, but when do I hand trap against Fire King Snake? Alright, this section is for you here. So I am going to talk about the top 10 most meta relevant decks currently at the time of recording this, which is in the beginning of August 2024. I imagine even if you're watching this a year from now, multiple of these decks will still be meta relevant, probably. So hopefully even a year from now, this part of the guide is still useful to you. But let's go ahead and start getting into it. Okay, so the first deck I'm going to talk about is Yubel, which at the time of recording this is actually pretty significantly the most popular deck in upper, and actually all Master Duel ranked ladder, but especially upper ranks. So it's also the newest of these decks. So I imagine there's a fair number of people looking to know when exactly do I use hand traps against Yubel. So let's start off with Maxx. When it comes to Maxx, one of my favorite times to use Maxx against Yubel is actually in response to the summon of Samsara D-Lotus, but not the effect. We're immediately in our first matchup specific, hand trap coverage. We actually already see why those toggle settings are so important, right? And why you want to have activation confirmation on going into your opponent's turn. Because if you are on auto instead of on, you would not be able to use Maxx after Samsara D-Lotus is summoned. You would have to wait until after they already activate the effect. But the reason to Maxx while the Samsara D-Lotus is still on the field is because it plays around Psyframe Gear Gamma. Gamma is particularly popular in Yubel, as I touched upon earlier. At the time of recording this, I believe, according to Untapped, which focuses more on ranked ladder, Gamma sees play in about 50% of decks. And according to Master Duel meta with a tournament focus, it actually sees play in 67% of decks. So definitely best to play around Gamma in general, in my opinion, but especially for certain decks like Yubel. So again, if they lead Samsara D-Lotus, or if they lead Nightmare Throne to add and then summon Samsara D-Lotus, I will like to use Maxx while the D-Lotus is still on the field before it's used its effect. If they lead with Dark Beckoning Beast to add gates, activate gates, add Beckoning Beast, and then normal summon another Beckoning Beast, or if they lead gates to normal summon Beckoning Beast and then Beckoning Beast to add Chaos Summoning Beast, and they use the extra normal summon on that, I like to Maxx while they have these two fiend monsters on the field, right? As I've mentioned many times before and will continue to, it's all about getting your opponent to use up those resources. If we shotgun Maxx, they can simply hold Dark Beckoning Beast and then potentially on a follow-up turn just normal summon it to start plays. However, by Maxxing while they already have the two fiends with 0 attack on the field, now they're at a point where, like, okay, I could go into SP and give them a draw, which is probably what they're going to do, but that's much better than them going into Yama and then Charvara, right? And you also do still get to draw off the Maxx. Some people might just straight up end their turn there, which is obviously, I would trade a card in my hand to not have to deal with an SP on the opponent's turn. I think that's definitely a very favorable trade. Alright, for Ash Blossom against Yubel, I tend to prioritize the Samsara D-Lotus. If they start with Nightmare Throne, or 1-for-1, or Purrely Reese map, they're probably just going to use those to go into the Lotus anyway, so you can save it for that. Because if they activate Nightmare Throne and you Ash Blossom it, there's a chance they could just normal summon a Lotus that was in their hand anyway. So I like to wait for Lotus, if they start with, again, Throne 1/1 or Purrely's map. If they lead with Dark Beckoning Beast or Opening, you could use it against those, the Beast or the Opening, to hopefully stop their plays before, they even really get started. But there is also an argument that you could wait to Ash Blossom the Yama, because that way you make sure they don't use the extra normal summon for Lotus, right? For example, if they normal summon Dark Beckoning Beast and you Ash Blossom it, Ash Blossom only negates the activation of that one effect, right? It doesn't negate the effect altogether like Valor and Imperm. So if they normal summon Beckoning Beast and you Ash it, they could still extra normal summon a Lotus from hand potentially. So if you want to be extra safe, again, you could wait until they Beckoning Beast, Gates, Beast, link into Yama, and then Ash the Yama, because then you know they're not going to go into Lotus that turn. Just do be mindful that they can still end on Unchained Soul of Rage if you do choose to wait until Yama to Ash that. For Valor, Imperm, and Gamma, if they use Lotus, if they lead by normal summoning Dark, Samsara D Lotus, you can use Valor and Imperm on it when it's summoned to make sure that it's negated. Because cards like D Lotus, this is true also of like Rescue Cat, for example, is that even though they tribute themselves to activate the effect, they're still activated on the field. So if they got Valored or Impermed, they'll still be negated, even though again they tributed themselves, right? If they lead with Dark Beckoning Beast, you should definitely chain to its effect with Valor, Imperm, or also Gamma as well. But that monster effect negation, it is actually worth it to use it on the Beckoning Beast, because as I mentioned before, if you Valor a Dark Beckoning Beast, they don't get the extra normal summon. One thing you do want to watch out for, as you are negating, however, is for if they opening of the Spirit Gates, because if they do, they can link off their D-Lotus or Beckoning Beast for Salmon Great Almirage, then activate Opening, discard a card, bring the monster back, and then potentially do plays anyway. So that requires them to open opening of the Spirit Gates in their hand. So I think it's still worth it to use the monster effect negates early on, but just be mindful that they could potentially use opening to get around that. And finally, Nibiru. If they start with Nightmare Throne or Samsara D Lotus, then I generally like to use it on the 5th summon if Phantom isn't already in play, Phantom of Yubel, because Phantom of Yubel tends to come down very shortly after the 5th summon. In fact, I think it comes down immediately after the 5th summon. Sometimes they will be able to summon Phantom of Yubel before they get to 5 summons. In that case, you should probably just try to throw out the Nibiru anyway. Well, you should throw it out during the end of the main phase, right? I guess at that point they might have Appaloosa on the field, but if you can get them to use up their Phantom of Yubel on the Nibiru, that's generally not bad, because you might not have to deal with it on your turn, but at the same time, it's not hard for them to make another Phantom of Yubel. So that's really what it comes down to with Nibiru against Yubel, is do they have Phantom in play? If no, just probably fire off the Nib. If they do, your Nib's probably not going to get much use. Okay, let's move on to Fire King Snake Eye. So this is, while not the most popular deck in the current Master Duel meta, what and a lot of people consider to be the best deck of the format. So another one that I'm sure a lot of people are probably going to be pretty eager to know when to use hand traps. All right, let's start with Maxx. Okay, so when it comes to using Maxx against both Fire King Snake Eye and a Pure Snake Eye, which we're going to talk about right after this, I actually have a lot of opinions about this, because a lot of people really like to fire off the Maxx or to use it in response to a draw phase wanted activation to try to get the draw off of Diabellstar. I think this is a misplay. I think even if you know they have Diabellstar, even if they draw phase wanted, I think it's a misplay to use Maxx in response to that. I say let them summon her first, because it uses up more of their resources, right? For example, if they draw phase wanted and you activated Maxx, again, they could simply pass and then not give you any draws, and also still have the Diabellstar to use later in the turn. But it's not even just the Diabellstar, because remember, Diabellstar has to send a card from the hand to the graveyard. And it's not uncommon for me to see people send stuff like Effect Valor or Call By, or sometimes even like an Imperm in order to summon the Diabell, right? So let's say that your opponent activates Wanted during the draw phase and you don't use Maxx. Rather, you let them special summon the Diabel and they send an Effect Veiler and set the original Sinful Spoils. Now that's already an Effect Veiler that you're not going to have to deal with, right, on your turn, because your opponent already sent it off of the Diabel Star. Not only that, but again, now the Diabel Star is on the field. It's not sitting in your opponent's hand waiting to be used for a future turn. This is like kind of the epitome of why I don't think firing off Maxx is right. Not only if you don't know what matchup you're against, but even if you know your opponent has Diabel Star, I don't think it's right to fire off Maxx. So if they do set the original Sinful Spoils after summoning Diabel Star, you could chain to that, but you could also consider activating Maxx while the Diabel Star is still on the field before they activate OSS, because then you're playing around Gamma, right? If you wait for them to activate OSS, it sends Diabel Star to the graveyard as a cost, so they won't have any monsters on the field and you could get Gamma'd. You could, in theory, also wait for them to special Snake Eye Ash, then activate Snake Eye Ash and activate the effect to add Poplar, and then when they go to special Poplar, you can chain Maxx if you want to guarantee the draw. But this also will get them the Snake Eye Ash and the Poplar on the field, so really, I think it comes down to those sort of options right there. I think that's, again, the best way to maximize getting advantage off of Maxx while still playing around Gamma. Otherwise, if they don't lead with like Wanted or Diabel Star, you can just chain Maxx to the activate effect of Poplar or Ponix or Garunix whenever those monsters try to special summon themselves. Those are all activated effects. Alright, for Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. So if they lead Diabel Star or Poplar or Snake Eye Ash into Poplar and search original Sinful Spoils, you should actually wait and use it against the original Sinful Spoils, because that will keep them off of Fire King stuff. Like, again, for example, let's say you have Ash Blossom and no other hand traps in hand. They lead with normal summon Snake Eye Ash. They normal summon Snake Eye Ash, and then they would add Poplar, special Poplar, Poplar effect, add original Sin, link off Poplar for Link Kribo, put the Poplar in the Spell Trap, then activate Original Sin, sending the Poplar in the Spell Trap. By using Ash Blossom here, you keep them off their Fire King engine completely, and then you leave them on Ash Blossom or Snake Eye Ash and Link Kribo on the field. And sure, they could activate Snake Eye Ash's second effect, but then they're not going to have, they're going to have Flamberge and nothing else, right? So, I see a lot of people using Ash Blossom against Snake Eye Ash's first effect. I think that's always a misplay, even against Pure Snake Eye. We'll talk about that later in a little bit here when we talk about the Pure Snake Eye matchup. But I also see it used against Poplar Search. I think that is always a misplay. And yeah, again, I would just wait for Original Sin in a lot of these cases. On the other hand, if they lead with Ponix or Fire King Island, I would probably just use it against the island. That way they, won't be able to add new Garunix and then, pop a fire monster and do all that stuff. If they lead with Ulcanix by normal summoning Ulcanix, you can just use it against Ulcanix and see, hopefully that'll be enough to stop their plays, right? Otherwise, they will get to search Ponix and all that stuff. Using it against Ulcanix will also ideally keep them on only one monster on the board. Never use it against Bonfire or Wanted, as we talked about before in the general use section for Ash Blossom. Cards like Bonfire and Wanted are always going to lead to stuff that's going to get ashed anyway, so I would never, ever ash Bonfire or Wanted. Alright, for Effect Veiler, Imperm, and Gamma, if they lead by normal summoning Snake Eye Ash, or Ponix, or Poplar, or Ulcanix, I would use any of these cards against that first summon just to stop their plays early, right? I would not negate Diabel Star on turn 1 pretty much ever. I would just wait for them to summon something off of Original Sin and then just negate that. However, if you have cards in play, if it's like turn 2, for example, and you have a board, then I think you should use Monster Effect Negation on the Diabel Star, so that way they can't set the Subversion and then just use that to start outing your board, right? Do also be careful, though, about using Gamma against, like, Ulcanix, for example, because that will still let them summon the Fire King High Avatar Garunix. Also, using Gamma on fire monsters in this matchup, if they happen to open new Garunix, which is a one-of, so it's not particularly often, it doesn't happen often, but it has happened to me where I've Gamma'd their fire monster and they had new Garunix in hand and they were able to just make plays anyway. So be mindful of that when using Gamma in particular in this matchup. And finally, Nibiru, the Primal Being. Nibiru's pretty good against both this and Pure Snake Eye. However, against Fire King Snake Eye, timing is very, very important when using Nibiru, right? If possible, try to time it after they've summoned 2 level 1 fires off of Flamberge, but before they summon Fire King High Avatar Arvada. There are a lot of Fire King lines, Fire King Snake Eye lines that will put the Arvada on the field, so definitely look out for if your opponent's about to do that. They'll almost always do it by reviving it from the graveyard, so it should be fairly telegraphed. Make sure you get the Nibiru in before that, otherwise the Arvada can simply negate it, right? Alright, going into Pure Snake Eye. So Pure Snake Eye, gonna be some slight differences here that we'll talk about between when you use hand traps against this variant as opposed to against Fire King Snake Eye. Maxx, however, is generally the same as the Fire King variant. Do not fire it off. Again, in my opinion, you really should wait until after they summon Yubel Star to make them use up those resources if they do lead with her. If they lead with Snake Eye Ash or Bonfire for Snake Eye Ash, then you can Maxx just when they activate the Poplar's effect. And then if they lead with Snake Eye's Poplar, you can use it when they activate Original Sinful Spoils, right? In every one of these situations, they would have a monster in play, so this all plays around Gamma. And again, by using Maxx while Diabell Star is on the field, before they've activated the original sin they set with it, that also plays around Gamma. So, yeah, I think those are pretty good times to Maxx there. For Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, if they lead with Diabell Star or Snake Eyes Poplar, that's pretty simple. You can just Ash Blossom the original Sinful Spoils. If they lead with Bonfire or for Snake Eye Ash, or they just lead with Snake Eye Ash, you actually want to wait until Snake Eye Ash's second effect. That'll leave them with only Linkuriboh, Temple, and 1 monster in the Spell Trap Zone. So the way that you know, because the first thing you're probably asking is like, okay, well, how do I know though if they're going to be on Pure or Fire King to know when to use the Ash Blossom, right? Again, as I've discussed many times before, knowledge of the matchup, knowledge of your opponent's deck, so crucial for this. So the way to know if it's Pure Snake Eye is if Poplar searches Divine Temple, right? If they go normal summon Snake Eye Ash, add Poplar, special Poplar, add Divine Temple, that's like 95% of the time going to be Pure Snake Eye. If they add Original Sinful Spoils, that's probably like 70% of the time I'd say it would be Fire King Snake Eye. Maybe more like 80%. It could still be Pure Snake Eye. There are some hands if they open Temple or in some other situations where they would add OSS anyway. But, you know, if they do grab OSS and they activate it, even if it's Pure Snake Eye, it's still fine to just use Ash Blossom there anyway. That's still pretty good, right? But again, if they add Divine Temple, you want to wait until the Snake Eye Ash's second effect to leave them with the worst board state possible. Because, again, they normal summon Snake Eye Ash, activate the effect, add Poplar, special Poplar, Poplar effect, add Temple, activate Temple. Let's say they place Oak, because that's what a lot of people do on the turn 1 combo line. They place Oak. They link off Poplar for Linkuriboh, put Poplar in a spell trap. Now they're activating Snake Eye Ash's second effect, sending it and Oak. If you Ash Blossom here, now all they have, as mentioned before, is Linkuriboh, Temple, and Poplar in a spell trap, and that's it. So that's why you really want to wait with Ash Blossom against Pure Snake Eye. God, especially when before the Fire King stuff came out and Ash and Wanted and Bonfire were still all at like 3, that was such a common misplay I would see all the time, is people using Ash Blossom against Snake Eye Ash's first effect, and then, you know, the person just plays in their face-up card, and then they just use Snake Eye Ash's second effect and combo anyway. Definitely, in these situations, you should wait for the second effect of Snake Eye Ash for Ash Blossom. And as discussed before, don't ever use Ash Blossom on Bonfire or Wanted. Okay, for Valor, Imperm, and Gamma, on turn 1, you should just always use these against Snake Eye Ash. Even if they open Diabell Star or Poplar, you let those resolve and then let OSS resolve, and they'll always end up going into Snake Eye Ash at some point. So definitely just wait to hold that effect negation for the Snake Eye Ash to make sure that they're not going to be able to do any plays. On turn 2, as I mentioned before in the Fire King Snake Eye section, do consider using these negates against Diabell Star and possibly even Poplar, so that way they can't search Subversion and then start board breaking you. This could also, though, depend on how valuable your board is. If your board state is not one that's going to put up a big fight against Snake Eye anyway, you could, in theory, let them subversion your stuff and then just negate the Snake Eye Ash anyway. Alright, and then finally, Nibiru the Primal Being. So unlike Fire King Snake Eye, Pure Snake Eye doesn't have a monster negate to weave into their turn 1 combo line. So this is actually one of those matchups I touched on before, where you can wait until the end of the main phase and then Nibiru them, right? Because they would have, you know, Raging Phoenix and Flamberge on the field with IP and the spell Trap most likely. And if you nib those, then now the Flamberge has already used the effects, so they won't get more level 1s, and the only way they can summon IP is off of Temple, but even if they do, IP is still going to be the only card in the field. So yeah, they also won't have a fire monster in the field at this point in order to go into, well, sorry, I misspoke earlier. They'll have IP plus the token, but Snake Eye can't go into anything with that because SP requires 2 effect monsters. So, and they also won't have a fire monster on the field, so they won't be able to use the graveyard effect of Promethean Princess. So yeah, Pure Snake Eye might not seem like it, but on the surface, but you can just wait until end of main with Nib and just completely get them. Unless there is one very, very specific situation where this is not true, and that's if they summon Selene on turn 1, Selene, Queen of Master Magicians. If you ever see them summon her on turn 1 and you have Nib on that summon, or Nib when she brings something back, whatever, because they are going to go into a 2-mat Apo. That is the one instance, and it's actually relatively rare, honestly, but that is the one instance where Pure Snake Eye does end on a monster negate on turn 1, but it's, again, very telegraphed by going into Selene, so if you see Selene, nib them, but that won't happen often, and when it doesn't, you can just wait until the end of their main, making Nibiru actually a very effective tool against Pure Snake Eye. Alright, next matchup here, let's talk about Rescue Ace, another one of the most powerful, in my opinion, decks currently in Master Duel at the time of recording this, but Rescue Ace. So, for Maxx, this is another deck that plays Diabell Star, and again, I would not try to fire off Maxx to get the draw off of Diabell. It would actually be a little bit better to do that in this matchup than a Snake Eye matchup, but on Master Duel Best of 1 ranked ladder, even if your opponent leads with Wanted for Diabell, it's impossible to know whether they are on Rescue Ace or a Snake Eye variant. Now, if they're on over 40, it is very slightly more likely for them to be on Rescue Ace. That said, there are plenty of Fire King Snake Eye decks and other Snake Eye decks that play more than 40, and there are plenty of 40-card Rescue Ace decks. So don't take that as like gospel, but that is something you can kind of look out for. So for when to use Maxx, you could chain it to OSS or to play around Gamma. You could wait until they activate Emergency, just wait until they have a monster on the field. Turbulence and Preventer summons can be chained to, so overall there's relatively little risk in waiting to Maxx against Rescue Ace, even though, again, the main reason I say it would be slightly better to fire off Maxx against Diabell Star if you knew for sure it was Rescue Ace is that this deck actually doesn't special summon nearly as much as a lot of other decks, so it's easier for this deck to play around Maxx, and you're going to get fewer draws off of it, which is why, again, if you knew 100% for sure it was Rescue Ace, it would be, like, slightly better to fire off the Maxx. Okay, for Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring against Rescue Ace, if they lead with Diabell Star or Bonfire for Poplar, then you can just wait and use the Ash Blossom against the OSS, the original Sinful Spoils. If they lead with the Preventer, don't negate that. I would definitely just wait for the Emergency. Emergency is, for Rescue Ace specifically, definitely going to be one of the better cards to hit. It's one of their best spell cards. But, again, if they lead with Diabell Star or Bonfire for Poplar, you can use it against OSS. If they lead Diabell Star, you won't know necessarily for certain that they're on Rescue Ace anyway. If they activate Bonfire and add a Poplar as like the first play instead of Snake Eye Ash, then you can actually be reasonably certain that you are going up against Rescue Ace, but you probably would still want to Ash Blossom the OSS anyway to try to keep them off of Hydrant if at all possible. Again, don't use it against Bonfire or Wanted. Okay, so on to monster negates, Valor, Imperm, Gamma. So using Valor and Imperm in particular against Rescue Ace it's actually really, really tricky. I'm not gonna lie. Because here's the thing, right? You can use Valor and Imperm against either Preventer or Turbulence, and there's pros and cons to each of them. If you use it against Preventer, they could very easily have Emergency in hand, and then just kind of dodge the negate, right? And that's actually kind of true for negating a Hydrant if they lead by like normal summoning that or something. They could, again, very easily have the Emergency in hand already, which will be very, very bad for you because not only does that, effectively negate your Valor / Imperm, their card resolves anyway, but then they also get the monster off of an Emergency. So all in all, bad time for you. So you might think like, okay, then it's best to wait for Turbulence and negate the set for it, right? And for a long time playing against this deck, that was actually true, until the release of SP Little Knight. Because now Rescue Ace can very easily, often is just part of their turn one, like one card plays, make an SP alongside the Turbulence. And if that happens, then if you try to Valor or Imperm the Turbulence when it activates, or even just in general, right? Then they can just use the SP Little Knight effect to dodge. So one thing that I guess you could do in theory is that you could wait for them to summon Turbulence, and then on the summon, before they activate the effect, activate the Valor or Imperm on it. And even if they have Little Knight on the field and they dodge, right, they banish both of them until the end phase is what I mean by that, they still won't be able to set for because now Turbulence is no longer on the field. This play does also run the risk, though, of them having a follow-up Turbulence or a follow-up way to get to another Turbulence and then setting for it anyway, but that's kind of niche. So, all in all, what's the right answer? This is kind of one of those situations where I don't know if there is a one right answer, and that will happen sometimes, right? And I think that's another reason why it can be difficult and even a little frustrating at times for people trying to figure out, like, okay, when do I use the hand traps? And then they get the response of like, well, it depends. Because sometimes it just does depend on, like, all right, which you want to try to play into more. Like, do you want to try to negate their plays early and hope they don't have the Emergency in hand? Or do you want to wait? Although the more I think about it, and I don't even know if I've actually tried this myself in a duel, but I mentioned just now using Valor or Imperm against the summon, or right after they summon Turbulence, but before they use the effect, if they have SP in play, that might actually just be the right answer. For Gamma, on the other hand, let me think for a second. So Gamma, I mean, you can just use Gamma on Turbulence, right? Because even if they activate SP, it'll still be negated. Because unlike Valor and Imperm, Gamma doesn't care where it's negated. So I think Turbulence is actually the answer. I think the more I think about this and the more I talk it out to myself, the more that just using these negates on Turbulence is the way to go. But again, Valor and Imperm you want to use before Turbulence actually activates its effect, if SP is in play. If not, then you can wait for it to activate, and then they won't be able to use the once per turn effect again. But again, if they have SP in play, do it so that they have to banish before they activate Turbulence's effect, and then they can't set for it. Finally, let's talk about Nibiru. With this deck, there's a pretty decent chance they won't even get to 5 summons, but if they do, you can just wait for Turbulence. Unless you think they're about to summon Appaloosa. It's pretty rare, in my experience, both playing with and against the deck, for Rescue Ace to be able to summon Appaloosa on turn 1. They usually have to have like a pretty nutso hand to be able to do that. But if you do see that they have like a ton of monsters in play, and they're probably about to link them all off, then yeah, you could just nib then. Otherwise, again, just wait for Turbulence. It doesn't matter if they have SP in play, because again, if you Nibiru when the Turbulence summons, then they go to SP and they dodge the nib board wipe, they still don't get to set for it. Okay, let's talk about Tearlaments. Tearlaments is a deck that's been around for quite a while. I think, yeah, over a year at this point, and still definitely one of the most prominent decks in the meta. Definitely, I think in my opinion, probably a lot of people's opinion, one of the top 5 decks of the meta even. So definitely a good one to know how to play against. For Maxx, pretty much every single, I think actually every single one of their special summons is an activated effect, so I'm just chained to those. For a lot of the Tearlaments archetype stuff, right? Horus cards, on the other hand, which are often paired with Tearlaments, don't start a chain to summon themselves. So This is, I guess, just good advice for using Maxx against Horus cards in general, but if they activate Kingsark without if they activate Kingsark with a Horus monster in the graveyard, like Imseti, for example, then you activate Maxx in response to the activation of Kingsark to make sure that you get those draws, right? However, if they activate Kingsark without Horus monsters in the graveyard, you can definitely let them discard first and then chain Maxx. Again, that way they're eating up resources from their hand to send the Horus monsters to the graveyard, and then you still have the Maxx to gain draws if they do choose to summon. Also, if they are on the Horus engine, and this is again just advice against for playing against Horus in general, chain Maxx to Imseti's effect, because it doesn't just search Kingsark, it also draws a card. And as we touched on way earlier in the general use section of the combo guide, chaining Maxx to effects that draw cards is good in case they top deck Ash Blossom or Callby. Alright, for Ash Blossom, I would definitely Ash Blossom a Tearlament deck early, right? You can use Ash Blossom against Kid Close, but you know, as we've touched on before, Ash Blossom doesn't negate the whole of a card for the whole turn. It only negates that one activation. So yes, you can Ash Blossom to stop the search, but they can still use the second effect of Kid Close to mill 5, right? So I would definitely rather Ash Blossom Rhino Heart, that's being normal summoned, for example, and just hedge that they don't have any more plays, because Ash Blossom and Kikkalos will pretty much never outright end their turn. But occasionally, if they don't have any extenders, Ash Blossoming Rhino Heart will. So yeah, this is definitely a case where I would definitely use it a little bit earlier and Ash Blossom the Rhino Heart. Of course, as always, though, make sure to watch out for Scream chain blocking. If they activate Tearlaments, Scream, and then normal Rhino Heart, then they can go Rhino Chainlink 1, Scream Chainlink 2, and then Ash Blossom, if you chain it there, would be negating the mill 3 for Scream. And I don't think that's worth it. In Tearlament or any matchup that mills, if all the opponent is doing is like milling less than 5 cards, then I don't think it's worth it to Ash Blossom. If they're milling 5 or more, like if it's grass especially, then yeah, you can definitely consider Ash Blossoming. But if they are ever milling under 5 cards, it's generally not really ever worth it to Ash Blossom. If they lead by activating Tearlament Shiren, this is actually one of the best cards that you could Ash Blossom in this matchup, right? Because when you Ash Blossom a Tearlament Shiren, it stops 3 things, actually. It stops them from sending a card from their hand to the graveyard, it stops them from milling 3, and it stops them from special summoning the Shiren itself. All of which are relevant things to stop in this matchup. So, Shiren, in my opinion, is kind of one of the best Ash Blossom targets, but I wouldn't save Ash Blossom for Shiren. I would, you know, if they lead with Rhino Heart again, I would Ash Blossom that. Don't Ash Blossom Purrely Rhino. I would just wait for them to add either the Rhino Heart or the Shiren, which they'll pretty much always add one of those two off the Purrely Rhino. If they lead Imseti, then you can Ash Blossom that. Imseti is another pretty good Ash target. Again, not just in this matchup, but against Horus in general. Okay, so for Valor and Imperm and Gamma. Valor and Imperm, unlike Ash Blossom, you do actually want to save these specifically for Kikkalos. So if I open Ash Blossom and nothing else, and a normal Rhino Heart, like I said, I'll use Ash Blossom against that. But if I open Valor or Imperm and nothing else, and a normal summon Rhino Heart, I'm gonna wait. I'm gonna wait for them to summon the Kikkalos because, as mentioned earlier, by using Valor and Imperm against Kikkalos, we not only stop the search, but we also stop the ladder effect, which allows them to mill 5. And there is a decent amount of the time where this will kind of just end the Tearlament player's turn. So this is one of those cases where, again, unlike Ash Blossom, not waiting, or not using it right away, rather, and waiting for the better target is the correct thing to do. Gamma is a card that destroys, obviously, as we touched on a lot before. And this is actually a matchup where that's not a good thing, because if you try to use it against, like, you know, Rhino Heart or Kikkalos or whatever, you'll just end up proccing, you know, their effects, right? So, I mean, to be fair, if you use it against Rhino Heart and stop the mill, even if they brought Rhino Heart back, they wouldn't get the mill, but they could still have a Fuser in hand that they're sending, right? So, the best time to use Gamma against Tearlaments is just on the Fusers themselves. That being Havnus and Shiren, of course. They activate already in the graveyard, so, you know, the destroy aspect doesn't matter at all. And again, just better to stop their fusions. So And finally, Nibiru, the Primal Being. This is a matchup where Nibiru is actually pretty bad. It's really, really hard to use Nibiru effectively against this deck without triggering just a bunch of their Tearlaments cards. And you might think like, okay, so I'll wait until later on the turn when they've already used like all of their Tearlaments effects. But by that point, they probably have Tearlaments Roll Close in play, which can simply negate and destroy the special summon of Nibiru, right? So, if at all possible, you know, just try to nib them when they have like a board of like random assorted monsters. Like if they're in a state where their board is like Tier Cash, Fairy Tale Snow, and like, I don't know, Perform a Trickon or something, and you can nib, it's like you might as well do it right then, even if you don't think it'll be enough to stop their plays. It's like you're not going to get too much of a better moment. So yeah, just wait for them to have a board of like assorted non-tier monsters, or Tearlaments Kashtira is not a big deal to send, but that, in my opinion, would probably be just about the only time you can really get a good use of Nibiru in this matchup in particular. All right, got 5 more decks that we're going to talk about here for these specific matchups. Next, I'm going to talk about Kashtira, which I don't think is really that good of a deck. I mean, it's fine. It's still Tier 3. It's a fine deck, but I wouldn't call this one of the top 10 most powerful decks currently in Master Duel, but it is probably one of the top. It's definitely actually one of the top 10 most popular. So I did want to cover it in this section of the video. So, all right, for using Maxx against Kashtira. So this is a matchup where if you somehow know 100% for sure that your opponent is playing Kashtira, this is the matchup where I think it's actually very good to fire off the Maxx on turn 1 during the draw or standby before the main phase, right? However, again, on Ranked Ladder, it is impossible to know for certain. And cosmetics are not an indicator of what deck the person is on. Like, you might see somebody with, like, you know, the Kashtira board, and I think there's a Rise Heart sleeves, and I'm sure there's some kind of a Kashtira icon. Your opponent could be on full Kashtira accessories, but, like, that's not a guarantee they're playing Kashtira. In fact, a lot of people will purposefully mislead by decking out on accessories like that. So don't use that as a limit for if your opponent is playing a certain deck or not. So, but here's the thing: I don't think that just firing off the Maxx is good, generally speaking. So you might think like, oh, I should fire off the Maxx every single time in case it's Kashtira and get those draws. But no, as we've discussed before, there are many, many reasons for literally every other matchup why you don't want to fire off Maxx. So I think it's actually the inverse. I think because any given matchup is more likely to not be Kashtira than not, by quite a bit too, you should not be firing off Maxx. And like, yeah, you'll miss one draw when you do happen to play against Kashtira, but I think that trade-off is worth it to have all the other better times to activate Maxx against all the other better matchups. It's worth it to miss one draw when you occasionally play against Kashtira, right? But if they lead with Unicorn, you just simply chain it to the Theosis. Otherwise, you just chain it to Rise Heart. Unless they activate Dimension Shifter, which they might at like the start of their turn, then you need to chain Maxx to D-Shifter just to make sure that you're resolving the C, because Maxx has to send itself to the graveyard as cost, and it can't do that with D-Shifter lingering effect active because that banishes everything. Like, yeah, the D-Shifter might be a stun deck, but it's better to hedge and make sure it's not Kashtira than to, you know, not play Maxx and then all of a sudden they're special and stuff, right? So, okay, when it comes to Ash Blossom, if they lead with Kashtira Unicorn, don't use Ash Blossom against it. I would wait for the Kashtira Theosis. 1, because they could have opened Kashtira Theosis and they're just going to search Birth anyway. Or 2, they're just going to search Birth anyway because they're not even a Kashtira deck. They're just using Kashtira as an engine. Since Pure Snake Eye has dramatically dropped in play after Snake Eye Ash and Wanted got limited, you don't see this quite as often as you used to, like earlier this year, but it is still something that's like not uncommon at all. So, you know, just because your opponent leads by specialing Unicorn, I would not assume they're on Kashtira. Wait for them to search, and then if they add Birth, they might just activate Theosis anyway. You can just Ash that. If they add Theosis, they're going to activate it, you just Ash it anyway. So it's It's fine either way. Ashing Wraitsoth is actually good. So I know I said, you know, in the general use section that ashing a spell card that searches another spell card is generally not that great. However, Kashtira, and this is one of the reasons why I don't think it's one of the top 10 most powerful decks in the format, its consistency is naturally very low. You know, Wraitsoth is at 1, Unicorn's at 2, Fenrir's at 1, Prosperity's at 1, Extrav is also at 1, Terraforming is banned, so it's not uncommon for Kashtira to only have one way to get their plays going. So I think that using the Ash Blossom on the Wraitsoth and not even having to deal with the Unicorn in the first place is actually a good play in this deck specifically. If they lead with Planet Pathfinder, don't use the Ash Blossom on that. Wait for them to add the Wraitsoth and activate it and Ash Blossom that. That way, any future copies of Planet Pathfinder that they draw are going to be dead. If they lead by specialing Fenrir and activating, you can Ash Blossom that. They're either going to add Rise Heart, or if they have Birth in hand, they're going to add Unicorn. Either way, you don't want that. Excuse me. And, oh yeah, Kashtira Ogre. I don't think I'd ever Ash Blossom this, because all they're going to add is Kashtira Preparations, which, if all they have is Ogre and Kashtira Prep and no other Kashtira monsters, Preparations doesn't really do anything anyway. But the reason why I wouldn't Ash Ogre is because, one, they could very easily just have a Theosis in hand anyway and then just go into plays. Two, even if they don't, the Ogre effect will give your opponent a lot of information about your top deck and about what deck you're playing, and you don't want to give them that for really no reason. Again, the Kashtira Preparations is so low impact that them searching that is like not a big deal at all. Alright, for Valor, Imperm, and Gamma, if they lead with Kashtira Unicorn, I would actually wait to Valor and Imperm until after they've activated Theosis and summoned Fenrir and use it on Fenrir's effect. This, once again, make sure they aren't just using Kashtira as an engine, right? Because it's so easy for them to special the Kashtira Unicorn. You use and activate its effect. You use your only Imperm in hand, your only hand trap is an Imperm, and use it on the Unicorn, and they're like, cool, Bonfire for Snake Eye Ash, normal summon Snake Eye Ash. And then you're just kind of like, well, fuck. Right? So here's the thing, though. If it is actually Kashtira, it's still not bad to wait like this, because if, again, they go for Unicorn and add Theosis, right? And activate Theosis for Fenrir, and then you Valor or Imperm on the Fenrir, they either have to end on Shangri-Ira pass or Unicorn plus Fenrir pass, which is definitely not as bad as a full cash board. So if they lead with Planet Pathfinder, I would actually negate it due to the deck's naturally low consistency, right? Similarly to the idea of negating the Wraitsoth with Ash Blossom to not have to deal with even a Unicorn. I would do the same thing with Valor and Imperm on Pathfinder. One thing to watch out with that is that if you negate the Pathfinder, they can still tribute it even if the effect won't resolve, but that's still good for them to do because then they won't have any monsters on the field and they could special summon a Kashtira monster in hand. Which if they have it, they have it, you know? Then they got really lucky because, again, the deck is naturally pretty bricky, but if they lead with Fenrir, especially that and activate it, you can just negate that. Although, actually, if they lead Fenrir and special it, I probably actually would not Valor or Imperm that, because it could still be Tearlaments, and they could just normal summon Rhino Heart. So actually strike that. I think I would wait for them to activate Fenrir, add, and then just, I guess, go from there. If they add Unicorn, they're probably going to go activate Birth, summon Unicorn, then you can negate the Unicorn potentially. Or you could, like, they'll grab Rise Heart and they'll summon that and you can negate that. Yeah, that's probably better. Ogre, don't negate it, just wait to see if they have Theosis. Nibiru, this is actually yet another one of those decks that does not make any monster negates at pretty much any point as part of their turn 1 plays. So, again, you can wait until end of main and get their whole board. And you'll get a lot, too, if you wait until end of main. You'll get the Rise Heart, you'll get the Ira, you'll get the Fenrir, that's summoned off of Big Bang. It's so good. Nibiru is actually Kashtira's biggest weakness. And between Nibiru, I guess to be fair, Pure Snake Eye isn't played as much anymore, but between Nibiru being so good against Pure Snake Eye and Kashtira, I was kind of shocked I didn't see more people on Nib back, you know, before Pure Cash, like before Ash got limited and Fire King stuff came out, right? Nib is still very good against Fire King Snake Eye as well, but it's a little trickier to use, as we touched on earlier. But Yeah, Nibiru is an extremely good hand trap in this matchup, and a lot of others. I think a lot of people don't play it because they're like a little intimidated by trying to actually use the Nib, but I think that if you're playing 3 Maxx, you should probably just be playing the Nibiru for matchups like these, and also just because it's good to draw into anyway. But anyway. Okay, next up we have Purrely. So even though this isn't as popular as something like Kashtira or Pure Snake Eye, I think Purrely is better than both of those decks. I think Purrely is up there alongside Tearlaments and Rescue Ace, Yubel, and Fire King Snake Eye as one of the top 5 best decks in the current metagame. So using hand traps against Purrely is actually a lot simpler than a lot of other matchups. I think this is yeah, this is my shortest section by far that I've typed out here. So for Purrely, Maxx, you can just use Maxx against their first quick play spell. If you want to play around Gamma though, which is actually very, very common in Purrely matchups, you could even wait for them to special summon the Purrely, and then use Maxx when they try to go for the Purrely second effect. But again, you could also just use it against quick play spells. It depends how much you're particularly caring about Gamma, which could depend on how many hand traps you have in hand. So for Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, most people wait for My Friend Purrely, which is generally a good idea, especially if they lead with it or Happy Memory. But if they lead with Pretty or Sleepy or Delicious Memory, you could consider ashing that, because if they special summon Purrely, they'll already have a good target for it, right? Like, let's say that, you know, they lead with Sleepy Memory, and they special summon Purrely, and you don't even ash that, you wait for them to add My Friend, they activate My Friend and ash that. They could still activate Purrely's effect and target the Sleepy, or again, Pretty or Delicious, and then, you know, have a good Xyz monster to go into. But the reason I'm more inclined to not ash Happy Memory is because I don't really care if they go into Purrely Happiness on turn 1. That doesn't really do anything. I would never ash regular Purrely, by the way. Like the white one, I would never ash regular Purrely because that effect isn't even guaranteed to add anything. And if they excavate and don't find a card to add, that's effectively like, it's like the card's already been negated, right? So, since Purrely has essentially a honestly pretty decent chance to negate itself, quote unquote, I would not bother ever using Ash Blossom on it. Valor, Imperm, and Gamma, this is exceedingly simple. Just use it on Purrely to stop both the search and summon effects. Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty much all I have to say about that. I guess, like, if they lead with regular Purrely and they excavate 3 and then they immediately activate, like, I don't know. Like, if they lead with normal summon, like, regular, like, white Purrely, and then they add, like, let's say, a Sleepy Memory, and then they immediately activate Purrely's effect to try to Xyz with the Sleepy Memory, I might actually negate that, because they might not actually have any other plays. But even if you negate that, they can still just activate the Sleepy Memory, right? And then they would summon Purrely anyway. So yeah, never mind. Just wait for Purrely. Just always wait for Purrely. And Nibiru. This deck probably just won't summon 5 times on their first turn. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they actually have a ton of plays, and they'll kind of overextend. You can get them with Nib before they summon the X-Purrely Noir. But if they're doing a standard turn 1 combo line where they go for the Purrely Noir and set Heap, they're not going to do 5 summons on their turn. So, but yeah, if they do, don't wait until end of main with Nib. Make sure to Nib before they summon the X-Purrely Noir. That's going to be unaffected by it. Alright, next up we have Labrynth. Labrynth being the most, I think, popular back row deck, yep. As far as like setting a bunch of trap cards and stuff, that's not stun. The most popular, that's not stun. Obviously not going to be covering stun in this guide, because these hand traps in general are really not that useful to get stun overall, but... so for using Maxx against Labrynth, this matchup is actually one of many reasons, in my opinion, why it's not good to fire off Maxx, because not only can Lab just set a bunch of back rows and pass, but Maxx is actually good against Lab. You know, when Lab has those turns where they're completely popping off and they're doing like every one of their effects, like they activate Ariana and, you know, RES and Lovely and Lady and Furniture and both welcomes. We've all seen that Lab turn where they use all those effects in one turn. Maxx is actually fantastic during a turn like that, because they're going to be doing a decent amount of summoning, right? But again, if you just fire off the Maxx blindly on turn 1, they'll just set a bunch and then just pass. So Honestly, you can just wait to chain Maxx to Welcome Lab or another activated effect that summons. It's pretty simple here, I think. Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. This is like gotta be one of the most well-known choke points in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! That is to just save Ash Blossom for their first Welcome Lab. Don't use it against Ariana, since they could have furniture to set a Welcome Lab anyway. And you do want to use it against the first Welcome Lab, because the first Welcome Lab will pretty much always, I mean, there are exceptions, but the first Welcome Lab will probably summon the Lovely Labrynth, and if Lovely Lab is in play, then you're not able to chain to the activation of normal trap cards, which means you will not be able to Ash Blossom future copies of Welcome Labrynth or Big Welcome Labrynth. So I would definitely make sure to get the first one there and make sure that, plus the Lovely is also, of course, going to pop a card on field or in hand, so all in all, just, yeah, very obvious, just Ash Blossom the first Welcome effect. Veiler, Imperm, and Gamma. If they normal summon the Ariana, you can definitely use Veiler and Imperm against that, because obviously you can't Veiler and Imperm the Welcome Trap card, so in that case it is nice to be able to stop them from searching. If you have Gamma, you could in theory wait. You could wait and see if they add furniture off of Ariana, or if they just use furniture at some point and negate that. Or you could also use it against Ariana, of course, to stop the search. Or you could also wait and see if they Coup Clock and use it against the Coup Clock. Even if they don't end up doing all that stuff, there's a lot of the time where the opponent will Welcome Lab, like during your draw or standby, and you might be able to get the Gamma on like the Lovely, for example, if they do choose to do it that way. So, whereas with Veiler and Imperm, I would just always do it on Ariana. Gamma is like, it's very situationally dependent, honestly, against Lab. You could do it against the Ariana turn 1, or there is also an argument to wait. It'd probably just be safer to just use it against the Ariana, though, I think, the majority of the time. Nibiru, this deck probably won't summon 5 times, the vast majority of the time. But if they do, you can just drop Nib. I don't really think there's any special timing to it. You know, if they're going to go into battle phase, you could do it during end of main. Probably just do it during end of main in general, right? Because I don't think Lab ever makes a monster negate. At least on board, like on the form of a monster. So yeah, I don't think there's really much special timing to Nib. If you even get the opportunity to Nib Labrynth, it probably won't happen, honestly. Okay, Branded Despia. One of the more prominent fusion decks alongside Tearlaments here in the current metagame. Definitely a fusion mainstay in the game for quite a while now. As far as Maxx goes, I think literally every single Branded Despia summon is an activated effect. So you can just use it against the first one of those. It's really not much to say as far as the timing of that. For Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, this is, alongside Welcome Lab, probably the most infamous checkpoint in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Meta, and that is to use Ash Blossom against Branded Fusion. Branded's pretty much always going to try to resolve this card, so I pretty much always just try to wait for it, if possible, to use the Ash Blossom. One other thing that I do as well is if I open Ash Blossom against Branded, I will toggle off. I will hold right click until they're about to activate the Branded Fusion, because a lot of the times what Branded players will do is they'll use various effects to kind of check and see if you have Ash before committing to activating Branded Fusion, right? They'll activate other search effects and see if priority gets passed over to you. So, you know, I would definitely, in my opinion, I think it's better to toggle off. I've seen some people be like, oh yeah, I toggle on the Ash to intimidate them, but I don't really think that ends up intimidating your opponent so much as lets them know how to play around what you have. So I would just more be inclined to trick them into thinking I don't have it, and then just getting them by surprise, right, and kind of ruining their plays. Because by the same token of your opponent will, you know, use other search effects to test for it. Once they see that you're not getting past priority, some players might ease up and like not play their turn optimally, assuming you don't have, you know, the Ash Blossom, and they might go into a play that leans really heavily into Branded Fusion. That'll kind of end their turn if it gets negated. However, I would not count on Ash Blossom negating Branded Fusion to end their turn. The deck has quite a few extenders, and it's definitely not hard for them to find plays, even if the Ash Blossom negates the Branded Fusion. But that said, that will be a huge impact no matter what. However, that is not the only time I would Ash Blossom necessarily. If it's turn 2, if you're going first, right? and they lead with like fusion deployment, then you can actually consider using Ash Blossom on that, because they could summon Albaz and then try to fuse away with one of your monsters on board. You know, just again trying to use the Ash Blossom to prevent a board breaking effect, much like negating a searcher for like subversion or something, right? So Valor, Imperm, and Gamma, if they lead with Alibur, you do actually want to negate that, because even if they have another way to get to Branded Fusion, it still stops them from adding Branded Lost, which is a very big pain to deal with, because they'll get them the Mercurial, or just get some more disruption. So, like, again, even if they already opened Branded Fusion, just even in that case, negating the Alibur is still a good benefit for you. If they lead with Quem, you can negate that, and, you know, although it's not likely to be the case, hopefully that will just stop their plays altogether. The Fusion Albion, the red one, is not a bad target either, because that'll stop another Fusion summon, but I will say that in general, it's really hard for one monster negate to have a lot of impact in this matchup. It really is, especially if it's like Valor Imperm. Gamma, of course, can destroy, so that's a little bit different, but yeah, Valor and Imperm, it's really hard to have just one of those against Branded Fusion, or Branded Despia, and that be enough to stop them. Let's see, for Nibiru in this matchup, whether you use it on the 5th summon or wait until end of main just kind of depends on if they can search Mercurial or not. That's going to be their main counter to Nibiru, so like, if they do have a Branded Lost up, and they haven't, you know, searched off it yet, I would definitely try to nib before they do get that search, because again, they'll try to grab Mercurial more than likely, and again, that is their primary way of stopping themselves from getting nibbed. Otherwise, yeah, you could wait until end of main. Just watch out for the end phase when a lot of branded effects activated, aka main phase 3 for them. Yeah. Okay, last one we're going to talk about is Mathmech. Mathmech, despite not being as popular as it once was, is still like pretty much at full power. We're really Circular still at 3. I know Diameter and Parallel Exceed are still hit, but that's not as big of a deal. With Circular still at 3, Mathmech is definitely still a very relevant matchup. So this will be the last one we talk about here. For Maxx against Mathmech, their stuff is all activated effects, so you can just chain to those. But however, I would also chain Maxx to Small World if they lead with that. That sounds kind of weird, but it's not uncommon for a Mathmech player who already opens Circular to use Small World to search the Ash Blossom, because Maxx is actually one of the more impactful hand traps against Mathmech. So, yeah, they definitely use Small World to search Ash Blossom a lot. So, in general, if your opponent leads by activating Small World and you have a Maxx in hand, you should probably just chain Maxx to it. That sounds really weird, but it does end up being correct a lot of the time. All right, for Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, honestly, I would just save this for Alimbertion Search. It might seem like a good idea to use it against Circular, because Circular searches the Superfactorial, but Alimbertion can also just search the Superfactorial. So if you Ash the Circular, they'll immediately go for Alimbertion, get it anyway. And then if they have an extender, they can just go into their plays anyway. This is also true, we'll talk about that in a minute, them having extenders if we have Valor or Imperm. Mathmech is kind of like Branded Despia. It's kind of hard for one negate to matter a lot against Mathmech, because Mathmech has room to play a lot of extenders in their deck, and if they have even one extender, they can push through like just about any hand trap. That's why Maxx is actually the most effective one against them, because it doesn't matter how many extenders they have, they can't use them to push through a Maxx, but they can use extenders to push through literally every other hand trap. So definitely worth keeping in mind. Don't ever use Ash Blossom against Signet Mining or Small World. Those will always just lead to stuff that you can negate anyway. There is actually kind of an argument to use against Signet Mining if you really, really want to. Like if you have more negates in hand, more hand traps rather, because Signet Mining does cost them a discard. As I touched on way earlier in the general use section, effects that cost your opponent a discard are not bad to Ash Blossom, but I think Signet Mining in this matchup is actually the one exception I would make, where like you're just gonna have a better Ash target later, and they discard the card either way, so it's like, yeah, I would probably just not Ash Signet Mining, I'd just wait. Definitely wouldn't Ash Small World, because they don't, banishing the card for Small World is not a cost, so yeah, definitely don't Ash Blossom the Small World. Okay, for Valor, Imperm, and Gamma, If they lead with Circular or Parallel Exceed, then like Ash Blossom, it's really best to use this against Labrynth and just hope they don't have an extender, right? However, if they lead with Firewall Defensor, then you can negate Splash Mage for a much higher impact play, because it'll be... Basically, at that point, you'll leave them with Splash Mage plus, like, I think the Firewall Guardian and nothing else on the field. Now, granted, they could still link off... Well, let's see, because they would normal summon Defensor, link Defensor into Lingaribo, special summon Defensor back, or special summon Guardian, then link those two into Splash Mage and bring back Guardian. Yeah, so if you Veiler or Imperm there, they don't get the second level 4, they can't go into Labrynth. They could link off the Guardian and go into Microcode. No, not Microcoder. Why can't I think of what the card is called? The link one that can bring itself back. That summoned... I can't think of that card's name. Anyway, basically they can end on Terahertz, but not a Mathmech setup. They won't have like the super factorial setup. So yeah, if they lead Firewall Defensor, Veiler, Imperm, or especially Gamma on the Splash Mage, super impactful. Gamma in general is actually very, very impactful against Mathmech, because if you negate and destroy Labrynth, for example, then they not only don't get to add the diameter to continue their plays, but they have one less body on the board, which means they need more than just the one extender to be able to continue. Especially true if you Gamma like Splash Mage on turn 1. Oh, that's brutal, because now they don't have a Link 2 on the field. That makes Link climbing very, very difficult, if not impossible, for the Mathmech player at that point. And finally, Nibiru. Much like Pure Snake Eye and Kashtira, Mathmech actually doesn't make negates on turn 1, so you can wait until the end of their main phase. You will still have to deal with Super Factorial, but anything else they make, Terahertz, Singularity, Heat Soul, can all be wiped. And it's actually very good to do so, because again, you will still have to deal with the Super Fact, but you won't have to deal with not only the big monsters on their board themselves, but also you won't have to deal with the D-Save Worm in the graveyard negating a Speller Trap, and if they went for the Microcoder Signet Conflict setup, then their Signet Conflict, the Counter Trap, Omni Negate, will not be live anymore either. So yeah, Nib actually very good against Mathmech. Again, you will still have to deal with Super Facts, but that's not that big of a deal. Okay, yeah, I think that's gonna pretty much do it for not only the specific matchups, but the hand trap guide in general. Wow, can't wait to edit this all down. At this point in time, my recording is up to over an hour and a half, and I actually still haven't even recorded the section where I show off my my gameplay settings yet, so I still need to do that. But anyway, wow, this was a big one, and I still got to edit it all too. That'll take even longer. So, but really, I really want to give a huge thank you all to all of you, not just the people who support on Patreon or with YouTube memberships, but definitely, again, extra huge special thank you to those people, but also all of you who are just watching the content like this. You know, with Yu-Gi-Oh in particular, it's obvious there's not as much of an interest in this kind of like competitive primer. You know, a lot of people would rather watch like special deck building challenges and stuff, and like, yeah, I think those are fun, but I do think there is something to be said about like the lack of this kind of content, especially for Master Duel. Master Duel is a format that often feels very overlooked and treated as lesser than by a lot of paper players. So I really, like, as always as ever, my goal with this channel has been to like get as many good resources for Master Duel out there as possible. So on that note, if you have any suggestions at all, feel free to leave those down in the comments section. I would definitely be more than happy to hear from you about not only this video, but if you have any ideas for future projects, you know, similar to this, I'm all ears. Again, like I touched on way at the beginning of the video, if you are interested in a follow-up hand trap guide where we talk about lesser played hand traps or more niche ones like again, Shifter, Ghost Ogre, Ghost Spell, that kind of a thing, I could definitely do that in the future. If there's any other general gameplay tips you're looking for, I'm all ears. And yeah, I gotta give you all a huge thanks for for checking this out. So thank you again. Extra special thank you to the Patreon members and the YouTube members who again not only voted for this video on the polls there, but without whom this and every other video I make would not be possible. So thank you all again. I think that's pretty much gonna do it. So we can just go ahead and move on now to our outro. Hey everybody, Hexlex here. Just want to give you a huge thanks for watching all the way to the very end of the video. Believe it or not, that is actually one of the best ways that you can support the channel, is by watching the videos in their entirety. But there are many ways in which you can support the channel if you are so interested. The names that you're seeing on screen here, I gotta give an extra special thanks to, because these are people who have chosen to either become a member on YouTube, which if you're interested you can do as well via the join button next to the subscribe button down there, or have signed up over on Patreon and become members there. Link to that is going to be in the description below. Without the support that is being offered by, again, all the people that you're seeing on screen right here, I would not be able to take the time to dedicate to uploading daily YouTube videos. So thank you so very much. But there are also other ways you can support as well. Again, link to the description below. If you like my deck tracker that you'll see in a lot of my videos, the Untapped Companion, you can download that for free, and if you use my affiliate link down there, then that also goes a long way towards supporting the channel. That's again free. So is subscribing here on YouTube. That's also free and a huge way to support. You can also check out Twitch, once again linked in the description below. Following and subscribing over there will not only support as well, but also give you notifications of when I go live if you want to catch some of the live streams. But really, no matter how you choose to support, it all adds up and it all definitely means the world. So thank you each and every one of you. For now, this is Hexlex. I'm going to be signing out, but more than that, I'm hoping that you have a fantastic day.